In the blink of an eye, my life fell apart. I left the hospital room for just 5 minutes to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. When I got back, room 305 was empty. Jessica was gone. Our newborn daughter, too. I looked around, confused, thinking maybe they had taken the baby for some routine exam. The blankets were thrown around carelessly, like she'd rushed out. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. "Sir, can I help you?" a passing nurse asked. My wife and my daughter, they were here. She checked the system and told me that Jessica had requested to be discharged on her own, against medical advice. She left with our daughter Emma. Without letting me know. Without leaving a note. Without returning my calls. As if I didn't exist. The first 48 hours were a blur of panic. I drove to her parents' place, called every friend, co-worker, distant cousin. Nobody knew anything, or so they said. I filed a police report, but when I explained the situation, the officers just exchanged looks. "Look, sir, technically a mother taking her own child isn't a crime," an officer explained as he handed me a card. "Your wife probably decided to leave on her own. It happens more often than you'd think." I spent weeks poring over bank statements, phone records, anything that might give me a clue. Our apartment turned into an impromptu investigation headquarters. I only slept when my body simply couldn't take it anymore, waking at the slightest sound, hoping she'd come back. The worst part was the nights. Standing at the door of the room we'd decorated together for Emma. The empty crib. The untouched stuffed animals. The nursing chair where Jessica was never going to sit again. After 2 months, my boss called me in for a serious talk. "Michael, you need to get back to work. I can't keep sheltering you forever." He was right. I was living like a ghost. I closed Emma's room door and started forcing myself into a routine. Gym. Work. Regular meals. One step at a time, just like my therapist suggested. It was during one of those therapy sessions that I had my first moment of clarity. "You can't control her choices, only your reaction," Dr. Torres said. Little by little, the apartment stopped being a sanctuary waiting for their return. I donated Emma's things to a charity. Every little teddy bear, every Odyssey I never got to put on her, represented a goodbye. A painful acceptance that maybe I'd never see them again. With my mind a bit clearer, I started noticing things I hadn't seen before. 3 weeks before the delivery, Jessica had been asking strange questions about our joint accounts. She wanted to know exactly how much we had saved for maternity leave. I found her notebook with notes from family law attorneys. The last entry was 2 days before the birth. Why would someone about to give birth be researching custody and child support? The pieces were starting to form a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Her behavior during the pregnancy suddenly made sense. The refusal to host a baby shower. The reluctance to post photos on social media. The way she avoided talking about our future plans. It wasn't just pre-birth anxiety, as I thought, it was a plan coming together. 5 months after she vanished, the doorbell rang. A process server handed me an envelope. My hands were shaking as I read the document. Jessica was suing me for child support. The summons included an address to appear in court. I had finally discovered where she was living, just 2 cities away. All this time, so geographically close yet so emotionally distant. The attached photo showed Emma, now with thicker hair and a 2-tooth smile. My daughter growing up without me, while I suffered wondering if they were okay. The document accused me of child abandonment and demanded 30% of my monthly income. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. As I held that official paper, a plan started forming in my mind. Jessica wanted to see me in court? Fine. I'd be there, but not the way she expected. The day of the hearing came faster than I expected. I woke up before dawn, mentally rehearsing what I'd say, or rather, what I wouldn't say. I chose a plain grey suit, nothing flashy. I wanted to look composed, controlled. the exact opposite of the shattered man I'd been over the past few months. I sat on the wooden bench in the courthouse hallway, watching people coming and going, lives being decided within those walls. Broken families, financial disputes, stories of betrayal. I was just another case in an overburdened judicial system. Then I saw her. Jessica walked in down the corridor wearing a conservative blue dress, her hair tied back in a low bun, her makeup soft. The perfect picture of a devoted, vulnerable mother. Next to her, a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase, her lawyer, I assumed. Not even a glance in my direction. As if we were complete strangers. Case number 47392, child support request, Jessica Montero versus Michael Almeida. The court official announced as the courtroom doors opened. Judge Thompson, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and sharp eyes, flipped through the initial documents in silence while everyone took their seats. I had chosen to go it alone, a decision that clearly surprised Jessica and her representative, who exchanged confident looks. Let's begin. Ms. Montero, please present your case, the judge said. Jessica stood up immediately, assuming a fragile posture. Her voice trembled just enough, not too much to sound fake, not too little to go unnoticed. Your Honor, I gave birth to our daughter Emma 5 months ago. During one of the toughest moments of my life, my husband simply disappeared. I felt the blood boil in my veins. The complete reversal of the truth was so absurd it almost sounded comical, if it weren't so tragic. I waited for him to come back. I called countless times. Sent messages. Nothing. Eventually, I had to leave the hospital alone, supported only by my mother. A strategically placed tear rolled down her cheek. I've had to raise our daughter alone ever since, with no financial support whatsoever. Her lawyer, introducing himself as Kevin Ribeiro, took the floor. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had won many similar battles. Your Honor, we have a clear case of family abandonment here. Mr. Almeida hasn't contributed a single penny to support the child. Ms. Montero is merely asking for what is rightfully her daughter's. Kevin presented bank statements, receipts of expenses for Emma, even a statement from Jessica's mother confirming her version of events. A well-rehearsed, detailed presentation. Mr. Almeida is just trying to dodge his responsibilities, Kevin continued. He should pay 30% of his monthly income in child support, plus back payments since Emma's birth. Jessica added, with barely concealed disdain, I always knew Michael wasn't cut out for being a dad, but I never imagined he'd just abandon us like that. Now he's trying to shirk his financial duties. He's always wanted to live it up without responsibilities, she continued, her voice growing firmer. I thought I could do a better job for my daughter. I'm not asking for anything for myself, just what Emma deserves. That's when she made her first tactical error. In a moment of arrogance, she blurted out, I'm not here to suck your money, Michael. I just want what's fair. Judge Thompson narrowed his eyes, picking up on the sudden change in tone. He looked at me then, genuinely interested for the first time. Mr. Almeida, do you have anything to say in your defense? I stood up calmly. Months of agony had prepared me for this moment. Your Honor, may I ask Ms. Montero a few questions first? The judge nodded, intrigued by my lawyer-free approach. Jessica, can you explain why you left the hospital without informing me? She hesitated for a second. You weren't there. You left and didn't come back. And how long did you wait before requesting discharge against medical advice? Kevin tried to interject, Your Honor, these questions are irrelevant. Let her answer, the judge interrupted. I waited long enough, she replied. Long enough like the 5 minutes it took me to get coffee from the hospital corridor. The silence in the courtroom grew thick. Jessica adjusted her posture. If you really tried to contact me, as you claim, then why did you block my number? Why did your family say they didn't know where you were when all your clothes and documents had vanished from our home? Jessica looked over at Kevin, who now seemed less confident. I have records of every call I made, of all the police reports. I have testimonies from hospital staff confirming I was gone for only a few minutes, I continued. But most importantly, Your Honor, I have evidence that proves beyond doubt this isn't about justice for Emma, it's about revenge and money. The moment had arrived. I opened my folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. The document that would change everything. Your Honor, I'd like to present this evidence. The judge motioned for the official to take the envelope, and he brought it to the judge. As the judge opened the document, I watched Jessica closely. For the first time, I saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. This is the result of a DNA test conducted under legal standards, as I requested through a prior court order, the very order which Ms. Montero wasn't informed of to avoid any chance of tampering. Judge Thompson read the document with growing attention, his eyebrows rising gradually. Over the past months, I uncovered evidence that Jessica was involved in an extramarital affair. I didn't bring this up initially because I believed Emma was my daughter, regardless of the circumstances. That is, until I discovered the elaborate plan to financially exploit me. Jessica suddenly stood up. That's ridiculous. He's making this up. Ms. Montero, please take your seat, the judge ordered, still examining the document. Mr. Almeida, explain how you obtained the genetic material for this test. When I received the summons, I immediately requested a court order for a paternity test. Since I still held legal rights, being legally married to Jessica, I was authorized to request a non-invasive sample. That sample was collected during one of Emma's routine pediatric visits, under the supervision of a court-appointed officer, and without her knowledge to prevent any tampering. Kevin whispered urgently to Jessica, who was growing paler by the second. This test, Your Honor, confirms with 99.9998% certainty that I am not the biological father of Emma. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica grabbed the edge of the table so tightly her fingers turned white. As the medical records show, I attended every prenatal appointment. I prepared a home to welcome a child I believed was mine. I bought furniture, clothes, toys. Our apartment had an entire room set up for her. I showed the photos of the baby's room on my phone. The pale yellow walls, the white crib, the dresser neatly stocked with diapers, the stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. All this, while Jessica apparently planned to abandon me at the hospital and later demand child support. Not just abandon me, but deliberately vanish, leaving me to wonder whether they were alive, whether they'd been in an accident, or even the victim of a crime. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as he alternated his gaze between the DNA test and Jessica, who now looked diminished in her seat. For 5 months, I lived in agony. I lost weight, almost lost my job, and developed chronic insomnia. All because of the disappearance of a child who, I now learn, isn't even my biological daughter. I turned directly to Jessica, meeting her gaze for the first time. You didn't just betray our relationship, Jessica. You coldly planned to use this child as a tool for extortion. You manipulated my genuine concern for Emma as a weapon. And worse, you deprived this little girl of the chance to know who her real biological father is, whoever that may be. Jessica abruptly stood up, her face a grimace of anger mixed with panic. That's a lie. This test must be wrong, she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. He's cooking the evidence to avoid responsibility. Kevin, her lawyer, tried unsuccessfully to calm her down, pulling her by the arm to seat her again. Judge Thompson banged his gavel repeatedly. Order in the court. Ms. Montero, control yourself immediately. I stood there, unmoving, watching as the elaborate fiction she'd so meticulously built crumbled. Michael, you know Emma is your daughter. Jessica tried switching tactics, her voice now pleading, her eyes welling up. How can you do this to her? To our little girl? Your Honor, I interjected calmly, I'd like to present more evidence. I pulled another document from my folder. This is a record of messages between Jessica and a friend, Carla Santos, dated 3 weeks before the delivery. I obtained legal access to them during the discovery process. The official took the document to the judge, who adjusted his glasses to read it. Jessica visibly paled. In these messages, Jessica clearly mentioned the plan to leave the hospital without me and then make Michael pay for the rest of his life. She specifically states that he will never know the truth about the baby and that it would be easier to get support from him than from the real father. Her lawyer, Kevin, realizing the gravity of the situation, slowly stood up. Your Honor, I request a brief recess so I can consult with my client. The judge ignored the request. Mr. Ribeiro, were you aware of these details when you filed this case? Kevin hesitated, his eyes bouncing between the judge and his client. Not to this extent, Your Honor. Seeing that she was losing control of the situation, Jessica completely changed her approach. The tears vanished instantly, replaced by a calculated coldness. Fine. So maybe Emma isn't biologically yours. So what? You're the father on the birth certificate. Legally, you're still responsible. Her lawyer briefly closed his eyes, visibly disturbed by this implicit admission of fraud. Actually, I replied calmly, I'm not listed as the father on the certificate. Jessica filled out the birth certificate on her own after leaving the hospital and left the father's field blank. I have an official copy here. I presented the document to the court. Jessica looked genuinely surprised that I had found that out. Jessica planned every detail, I continued. From hiding the affair, strategically leaving the hospital, to later filing for child support months after, when she figured I'd be vulnerable enough to just pay without question. Kevin whispered something urgently in her ear, probably advising her to shut up, but Jessica was past the point of holding back. You never valued what we had, she exploded. Always too busy with work, with your friends, never with me. What did you expect me to do? Ms. Montero. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel down. Are you aware that by what you just said, you've implicitly admitted to lying under oath in this court? The realization finally hit Jessica. She slumped in her seat as her lawyer muttered no further comment on her behalf. I'm not just aware of the infidelity now, I added calmly. I know that the extramarital relationship started well before the pregnancy. And I know that you deliberately deceived me into believing I would be a father, all while planning to use me as a cash cow. Jessica looked at me, a mix of hatred and fear in her eyes. For the first time since I met her, I saw her true face behind all the masks. I loved you, she whispered. I loved the future I imagined for the three of us. I never meant for it to end like this. Judge Thompson rearranged the documents in front of him, his expression stern. I believe I have enough information to make a decision on this case. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his hands folded over the documents scattered on his desk. His eyes swept the room, assessing each of us, before finally fixing directly on Jessica. In my 22 years on the bench, he began in a deep, controlled voice, I've rarely seen a case as disturbing as this one. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. Ms. Montero, this court exists to protect the rights of children and ensure they receive the financial support they need from their biological parents. It is not a tool for personal revenge or extortion. Jessica kept her eyes down now, avoiding the judge's penetrating stare. Her lawyer Kevin looked uneasy, shuffling papers unnecessarily. The evidence presented by Mr. Almeida is indisputable. The DNA test, performed under proper judicial protocol, scientifically proves that he is not the biological father of the child in question. Moreover, the additional documentation demonstrates a deliberate pattern of deception and fraudulent manipulation. He flipped a page in his notes. Mr. Almeida is not listed as the father on Emma's birth certificate, has no biological tie to the child, and was the victim of a premeditated scheme that involved abandoning his family under extremely cruel circumstances followed by an attempt at extortion through the judicial system. As the judge spoke, I watched Jessica. Her face was pale, but I noticed something more than fear, a growing irritation, as if she couldn't believe her plan had unraveled so completely. Therefore, Judge Thompson continued, this court denies the request for child support in its entirety. The case is hereby dismissed. Kevin murmured something to Jessica, and she simply shook her head in denial. For a moment, I thought that was it, but the judge wasn't finished. However, this case has additional serious implications that I cannot ignore. His tone grew noticeably harder. Ms. Montero, there is substantial evidence that you committed perjury by giving false testimony under oath in this court. Additionally, you attempted to use the judicial system to defraud Mr. Almeida. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even the clerk stopped typing for a moment. I am referring this case to the Public Prosecutor's Office for investigation of possible crimes of perjury, procedural fraud, and attempted extortion. Mr. Ribeiro, the judge said, looking at Jessica's lawyer, it would be wise to advise your client of the legal repercussions of these charges. Kevin nodded stiffly, his face a mask of professionalism, though I noticed a slight tremor in his hands. Mr. Almeida, the judge turned to me, his tone softening slightly. This court recognizes the extraordinary emotional and psychological torment you have endured. The deliberate abandonment at the moment of birth, followed by months of anguish and uncertainty, constitutes a severe form of emotional abuse. I took a deep breath, trying to keep from letting my emotions show. I didn't want to appear weak, not now, but the judge's words validated months of silent suffering. You have every right to pursue civil action for the moral and psychological damages you've suffered. Although this isn't within the scope of today's hearing, I note that there is sufficient basis for such a claim should you choose to proceed. I silently nodded my thanks. I hadn't decided yet whether to follow that path, but the official acknowledgement of my suffering meant more than any financial compensation ever could. Finally, the judge adjusted his glasses once more. With regard to the child Emma, who is an innocent victim in this deplorable situation, I strongly recommend that the true biological father be identified and held accountable for his parental responsibilities. At that moment, Jessica abruptly straightened, a look almost bordering on panic crossing her face. This court will notify the Child Protective Services to follow up on the case and ensure that the child's rights are fully protected. The judge struck his gavel firmly. This session is now adjourned. As everyone got up, Jessica remained seated as if she couldn't fully process what had just happened. Kevin quickly gathered his documents, visibly anxious to leave. When he passed by me heading for the exit, he mumbled a barely audible "I'm sorry." It wasn't clear whether it was a professional or personal apology, but I accepted it with a brief nod. Finally, Jessica stood up, and for the first time our eyes met without the barrier of lies between us. I waited to see anger, revenge, or even pleading in her eyes, but what I saw was something even more disturbing, a hollowness, as if I were just another obstacle in her path rather than a person she once promised to love. "This isn't over," she said just loud enough for me to hear. "It is over, Jessica," I replied calmly. "It ended the moment you left that hospital." I left the courthouse into a sunny spring afternoon. The contrast between the tension in the courtroom and the tranquility of the outside world was almost surreal. I sat on a bench in the nearby garden, trying to process everything that had happened. Technically, I had won. The child support claim was denied, the truth revealed, and Jessica would face consequences for her actions. But I didn't feel the euphoria I had imagined. It was a more complex feeling, like waking up from a nightmare only to discover that while the immediate danger was gone, the world was still not the same. I took out the little baby sock I'd kept with me all these months. A pink one with tiny embroidered lambs. I never got to put it on Emma. It was the only item from her room I couldn't bring myself to let go. For 5 months, I believed I was the father of a little girl I'd never met. I planned her future. Imagine taking her to the park, teaching her how to ride a bike, protecting her from life's disappointments. Now, this child I had loved without even knowing her wasn't mine. Neither biologically nor legally. A peculiar loss, like mourning someone who never truly existed the way I'd imagined. My phone buzzed. A message from Paolo, my best friend who had been with me through every moment of this nightmare. "Hey, how'd it go?" I stared at the message for a long minute before replying. "It's over." I started walking without a specific destination, just letting my feet take me. The sky was an exceptionally clear blue, not a cloud in sight, a detail I wouldn't have noticed months ago when my days were consumed by search and anguish. I passed a family in the park. A dad, a mom, and a little girl taking her first uncertain steps. The father held her hand, enthusiastically encouraging every move. In other times, that scene would have felt like a stab to my chest. Today, all I felt was a gentle twinge of melancholy. Then it hit me, the wound was still there, but it had finally stopped bleeding. I remembered my therapist's words, grief isn't just about losing someone who's dead. We also grieve the future we imagined that will never come to pass. I was grieving the future I'd built in my mind, a future with Jessica, with Emma, with the family I thought we'd have. That future was dead, and it needed to be properly laid to rest. I walked into a small, cozy cafe. I ordered a strong coffee and sat by the window, watching the bustle of the street. People rushing by, each with their own stories, their own unseen pains. How many of them were also trying to rebuild their shattered lives? I took out my phone and did something I'd been putting off for months. I deleted all the photos of Jessica when she was pregnant, every message, every plan we'd made together. Not out of anger or revenge, but as part of a necessary farewell ritual. With every deletion, I felt an invisible weight lifting. Then I sent a message to my therapist, scheduling a session for the next day. There was still so much to process, so much to understand about how I had been so completely deceived by someone I thought I knew inside out. On my way out of the cafe, I passed by a baby store. In the window, a mobile of stars and moons that I had once considered buying for Emma's room. For a moment, I stood there, looking. Then, for the first time in months, I genuinely smiled. Not out of happiness, but acceptance. I walked over to the shelter where I had donated the items from the baby's room months ago. The staff immediately recognized me. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah," I replied, taking the little sock out of my pocket. "I'd like to donate this too. I hope it can be useful for some child." She accepted the sock with a gentle smile, understanding without further explanation. "You know," she said, "sometimes we have to let go in order to move on." I nodded, knowing she was right. It wasn't just the sock I was letting go of that day, it was an entire chapter of my life. Back out on the sidewalk, I took a deep breath of the spring air. Jessica had taken so much from me and my trust, months of my life, the illusion of a family. But she hadn't taken my future. That still belonged to me, to be rebuilt on new, sturdier, and truer foundations. I called Paolo. "Hey, let's go out today. I haven't played a game of pool in ages." His surprise was audible. "Sure. You want me to call the guys?" "Yeah," I replied, feeling something light for the first time in months. It'd be great to see everyone. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. As I hung up, I looked up at the sky one more time. The pain hadn't vanished completely, maybe it never would, but now it was just a part of my story, not the whole of it. Emma would always be the daughter I thought I had, if only for a little while. Jessica would always be the biggest disappointment of my life. But I was more than these losses. The future remained open, full of possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. And, for the first time since that day at the hospital, I felt ready to discover them.